December 1944. The Ardennes forest stretched endlessly through eastern Belgium, its snow-covered pines hiding thousands of American soldiers who believed winter would bring a respite from the conflict. Among them was Private First Class Samuel Jackson of the 99th Infantry Division, a 23-year-old engineer from Philadelphia who had spent the past week being mocked by his own squad for carrying what appeared to be training ammunition. They had no idea that his wooden bullets would soon accomplish what seemed impossible, and that his name would be whispered in disbelief across German positions for reasons that would fundamentally challenge everything both sides understood about warfare. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What happened over the next 72 hours would transform Samuel Jackson from the most ridiculed man in his unit into a figure whose ingenuity would save hundreds of lives and expose a fatal vulnerability in the opposing military's most trusted tactics. The morning of December 16th began with an eerie silence that Sergeant William Morrison of the 2nd Battalion described in his diary as the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. The 99th Infantry Division held a 20-mile front in the densely forested Ardennes region, stretched impossibly thin, with approximately 15,000 men covering terrain that military doctrine suggested required at least twice that number. Morrison wrote that the fog hung so thick between the trees that visibility dropped to less than 50 yards, and the temperature hovered around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that rifle bolts froze if you did not keep them close to your body. Private Jackson sat in a foxhole reinforced with logs and frozen earth, methodically inspecting the contents of his pack, while his squad mates huddled around a carefully concealed fire. Corporal Danny O'Brien from Boston noticed what Jackson was doing and called out loudly enough for the entire section to hear. O'Brien said that Jackson was checking his toy bullets again, asking if he planned to scare the enemy to surrender by threatening them with splinters. The laughter that followed was harsh and tired, the kind of humor that emerges from men who have been cold and afraid for too long. What O'Brien and the others did not know was that Jackson's wooden bullets were not toys at all. They were carefully crafted training rounds that Jackson had modified based on his background as a mechanical engineering student, each one precisely weighted and balanced. But more importantly, Jackson had spent the previous 3 weeks developing a technique that exploited a specific weakness in the opposing force's defensive doctrine, something he had observed during reconnaissance patrols that no one else had noticed. He had tried explaining it to Lieutenant Robert Hayes 3 times, and each time Hayes had dismissed him with barely concealed impatience, telling him to focus on his assigned duties as a combat engineer. The mockery Jackson endured was not just about the wooden ammunition. As one of only a handful of black soldiers in a predominantly white infantry division, Jackson had grown accustomed to skepticism about his abilities despite his engineering degree from Howard University. Corporal O'Brien represented the casual prejudice that pervaded even progressive units. O'Brien would acknowledge Jackson's technical skills when convenient, but never missed an opportunity to undermine his credibility in front of others. Jackson had learned to absorb these insults with a calm exterior that masked profound determination. Jackson's journey to the Ardennes had begun months earlier, during training exercises in England, where the 99th Infantry Division prepared for eventual deployment to continental Europe. Even then, Jackson had demonstrated an unusual aptitude for solving tactical problems through unconventional means. During one training scenario, he had identified a flaw in the division's communication protocols that could have proven catastrophic under combat conditions. When he reported this to his commanding officers, they had initially dismissed his concerns, attributing them to inexperience rather than insight. Only after the same vulnerability was independently identified by visiting staff officers did Jackson's warning receive retroactive acknowledgement. This pattern of delayed recognition had followed Jackson throughout his military service. His engineering expertise made him valuable for technical tasks like bridge assessment, mine detection, and fortification design, but his broader tactical insights were consistently marginalized. The institutional resistance he encountered was never explicitly racial, but the pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. White soldiers with equivalent or lesser expertise received hearing for their ideas, while Jackson's proposals required extraordinary evidence before being considered seriously. At exactly 0530 hours on December 16th, the forest erupted. What sounded like thunder rolling across the hills was actually the largest artillery barrage the Western Front had witnessed since 1918. More than 1,600 artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front, delivering what German military planners estimated as approximately 50 million pounds of explosives in the first hour alone. The bombardment was so intense that soldiers in foxholes 5 miles behind the front lines reported feeling the ground shake like an earthquake. Lieutenant Hayes scrambled through the communication trench, his face pale in the pre-dawn darkness. He shouted orders that were barely audible over the screaming artillery, telling his platoon to prepare for ground assault. Hayes was 26 years old, a former insurance adjuster from Connecticut who had received his commission just 8 months earlier. His hands shook as he checked his carbine, and Private Jackson noted that the lieutenant loaded his magazine twice before realizing he had already done so. The artillery barrage lasted 90 minutes. When it finally stopped, the silence felt like a physical weight pressing down on everyone. Then came a sound that froze the courage of every American soldier who heard it, the distinctive rumble of tank engines, dozens of them, accompanied by the grinding of tracks on frozen ground. Through gaps in the fog, shapes began to emerge. The opposing forces were launching what would become known as their final major offensive of the war in Europe, committing more than 400,000 troops and over 1,000 armored vehicles to a desperate attempt to split the Allied armies and capture the vital supply port of Antwerp. But what terrified the American defenders was not just the scale of the assault. It was the realization that they were catastrophically outnumbered and outgunned. The 99th Infantry Division had been positioned in this sector precisely because command believed it was too rugged and difficult for large-scale armored operations. That assumption was about to cost lives. Private Jackson watched the first wave approach through the fog. He counted at least 200 infantry soldiers advancing in loose formation, with armored support rolling behind them. His squad had exactly 47 men in defensive positions, armed with standard rifles, 2 machine guns, and limited anti-tank capabilities. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. They could not win a conventional engagement. Sergeant Morrison called out targets, his voice steady despite the odds. He ordered concentrated fire on the approaching infantry, but Jackson did not raise his rifle. Instead, he pulled out a hand-drawn map of the sector and studied it with intense focus, looking for something the others could not see. O'Brien noticed and shouted at him, asking what he thought he was doing while everyone else fought. O'Brien said that Jackson's wooden bullets would not help them now, adding a curse that made several nearby soldiers glance over uncomfortably. Jackson ignored the insult. He had spent weeks mapping every tree, every depression, every unusual feature of this particular sector. What he had discovered was that the opposing forces were using sound discipline tactics that relied heavily on coordinated movement signals. Officers used specific whistle patterns and hand signals to direct their infantry, but in the fog and chaos of combat, they increasingly depended on audible commands that echoed through the forest in predictable ways. More critically, Jackson had observed something during his reconnaissance patrols that seemed insignificant at first. The enemy infantry wore a specific type of steel helmet that created a distinctive resonance when struck by even light impact. The design, intended to deflect shrapnel, had an unintended consequence. When hit at the right angle with sufficient force, the helmets rang like bells, producing a clear, high-pitched sound that carried through the forest. And according to the tactical doctrine Jackson had studied during his engineering training, certain enemy units had been trained to respond to specific acoustic signals by immediately taking cover. Jackson's wooden bullets were not designed to penetrate or cause harm. They were precisely weighted projectiles intended to strike helmets at calculated angles, producing sounds that would trigger conditioned tactical responses. But he needed the right conditions, the right range, and perfect timing. Most importantly, he needed his commanding officer to trust him enough to try something that sounded completely insane. The development of Jackson's wooden bullets had been a process of careful experimentation and refinement. During quiet periods between patrol duties, He had tested different wood densities, projectile shapes and weight distributions to find the optimal configuration. He carved each bullet by hand using tools borrowed from the engineering section, shaping them to achieve precise aerodynamic properties. The wood came from local trees, primarily beech and oak, which provided the hardness necessary to maintain structural integrity during flight, while remaining light enough to be fired from standard rifles with reduced powder charges. The first German infantry soldiers broke through the American forward positions within 20 minutes. The 99th Infantry Division fell back to secondary defensive lines, fighting desperately to maintain cohesion. Lieutenant Hayes established a command post in a reinforced bunker approximately 300 yards behind the original line, trying to coordinate a defense that was rapidly falling apart. His radio operator reported that communications with battalion headquarters were sporadic at best, with most runners failing to return from their delivery attempts. Jackson found Hayes during a brief lull in the fighting. The lieutenant was studying a map with red marks indicating lost positions, each one representing ground given up and soldiers fallen or captured. Jackson saluted sharply and said he had a plan that could neutralize advancing enemy infantry without expending their limited ammunition. Hayes looked at him with exhausted skepticism, asking if this was about the wooden bullets again. Jackson laid out his proposal with engineering precision. He explained that the opposing forces were advancing in coordinated waves using acoustic signals, that their helmets created specific resonance patterns when struck, and that he could exploit their tactical conditioning to make them believe they were under heavy fire when they were not. He needed 20 soldiers willing to follow his instructions exactly, and he needed Hayes to hold back the machine guns and create a corridor of apparent calm that would draw the enemy into the zone he had prepared. Hayes listened to this explanation with an expression that cycled between disbelief and desperate hope. He asked Jackson if he understood that what he was proposing sounded like complete madness, that wooden bullets could not defeat infantry, and that trying this tactic could cost them the position entirely. Jackson met his eyes and replied that conventional tactics had already failed, that they were going to lose the position anyway, and that his approach offered the only chance to disrupt the enemy advance without depleting their ammunition reserves before reinforcements arrived. Morrison, who had been listening to this exchange, stepped forward. The sergeant said quietly that he had watched Jackson work for 3 months, that the private knew things about engineering and acoustics that none of them understood, and that if Jackson said he could do something, it was worth trying. Morrison added that they had perhaps 2 hours before the position became completely untenable anyway, so what did they have to lose? Hayes stared at both men for a long moment, then gave a single sharp nod. He told Jackson he had 45 minutes to set up whatever he needed, and that if it did not work, Jackson would personally explain the failure to battalion command if any of them survived. Jackson saluted again and moved with sudden urgency, calling out names of soldiers he wanted in his team. The men Jackson selected were not the best shooters or the toughest fighters. They were musicians, hunters, and anyone else he had identified as having exceptional audio recognition abilities. He positioned them in a carefully planned arc that covered the most likely enemy approach routes, spacing them at intervals he had calculated based on sound propagation through cold, fog-laden air. Each man received 20 wooden bullets and explicit instructions about timing, angle of fire, and target selection. Private David Chen from San Francisco, a violinist before the war, asked Jackson how hitting helmets with wooden bullets was supposed to stop an armed enemy advance. Jackson explained that they were not trying to stop the soldiers directly. They were creating an acoustic environment that would trigger trained responses, making enemy troops believe they were advancing into a well-defended position with superior fields of fire. The key was coordination and the specific sound pattern that would emerge when multiple wooden projectiles struck steel helmets in rapid succession. Private Michael Torres from New Mexico, who had grown up hunting in the mountains and possessed an exceptional understanding of how sound traveled through terrain, grasped Jackson's concept immediately. Torres said that in the mountains, you learned to track game by listening for specific sounds at specific distances, that you developed an almost instinctive sense of where sounds originated and what they meant. He understood that Jackson was essentially turning the enemy soldiers into hunters who would react to acoustic cues the same way Torres reacted when tracking deer through forest. The enemy's next assault wave formed up in the fog approximately 400 yards away. Through binoculars, Hayes counted at least 150 infantry soldiers preparing to advance, with officers moving among the ranks issuing final instructions. He reported to Morrison that he hoped Jackson knew what he was doing because this assault wave would overrun their positions if conventional defense failed. Jackson took his position at the center of his acoustic team, watching the enemy formation through careful gaps in the defensive works. He had mapped every tree, every fold in the ground, every point where sound would echo or be absorbed. Now he needed perfect timing. He raised his hand, signaling his team to prepare, then dropped it sharply as the first enemy soldiers entered the zone he had designated as the optimal engagement area. 20 wooden bullets flew through the foggy air in precise sequence. Jackson had calculated the trajectories to ensure the projectiles struck helmets at angles that would maximize resonance without causing injury. The sound that resulted was unlike anything anyone on either side had heard before. A cascading series of clear, bell-like tones that rang through the forest with startling clarity. To the advancing infantry soldiers, it sounded like the distinctive crack of rifle fire being deflected by their helmets, suggesting they were under accurate fire from prepared positions. The enemy troops reacted exactly as their training dictated. They immediately dropped to prone positions and began returning fire toward the source of the sounds. But because Jackson's team had positioned themselves with careful attention to acoustic masking, the return fire went wide, striking trees and empty ground well away from the actual American positions. Jackson counted to 15, then signaled for the second volley. Another 20 wooden bullets struck helmets in a different pattern, this time creating sounds that suggested flanking fire from multiple directions. The opposing infantry formation began to fragment as soldiers moved to cover from threats they believed were surrounding them. Officers shouted orders, trying to maintain unit cohesion, but the acoustic confusion was working exactly as Jackson had predicted. Corporal O'Brien, watching this unfold from 30 yards away, whispered to another soldier that he could not believe what he was seeing. He said it looked like enemy soldiers were taking cover from nothing, hitting the ground and returning fire at empty forest. Morrison told him to watch and learn, adding that Jackson had just accomplished what 3 machine guns could not, breaking the enemy formation without expending real ammunition. But the most remarkable effect came when the enemy officers began using their whistles to redirect their disoriented troops. The whistle signals echoed through the forest in ways that Jackson had anticipated, and he had positioned 2 of his team members specifically to exploit this. When an officer blew a 3-tone sequence ordering his section to advance toward what he believed was the main American position, Jackson's marksmen struck the helmets of soldiers near that officer in a rhythm that mimicked the timing of the whistle signal. The resulting confusion made it seem like contradictory orders were coming from multiple sources. Within 8 minutes of the first wooden bullet being fired, the entire enemy assault wave had stalled. Soldiers were scattered in small groups, taking cover behind trees and in depressions, firing at perceived threats that did not exist. Their ammunition expenditure was enormous, while the Americans had used perhaps 100 rounds of actual bullets and 40 wooden projectiles. The energy balance of the engagement had reversed completely. Hayes watched through binoculars with an expression of stunned amazement. He said to Morrison that it should not be possible, that you could not defeat armed infantry with wooden bullets, yet the enemy formation was completely disrupted. Morrison replied that Jackson had not defeated them with wooden bullets, but with their own training, turning their tactical discipline into a vulnerability. The psychological impact on the opposing forces became apparent over the next hour. As subsequent assault waves approached the American positions, reports from the first wave spread through the enemy ranks. Soldiers began describing heavy defensive fire from well-concealed positions, talking about the distinctive sound of bullets striking helmets from multiple angles. The reports took on a life of their own, with each retelling adding details that had not actually occurred. Private First Class Johann Weber, a German infantryman who was captured 3 days later, described the experience in interrogation reports that were preserved in military archives. Weber said that his unit had been told to expect light resistance from exhausted American defenders, who lacked ammunition and heavy weapons. Instead, they encountered what seemed like a well-coordinated defense with overlapping fields of fire and precise targeting. Weber specifically mentioned the sound of projectiles striking helmets, which his training had taught him indicated accurate rifle fire from concealed positions. The fact that these sounds came from multiple directions simultaneously suggested to Weber and his fellow soldiers that they were advancing into a carefully prepared ambush. By mid-afternoon on December 16th, enemy commanders were reassessing their approach to this particular sector. Intelligence reports from captured American positions suggested the 99th Infantry Division was weak and poorly supplied, yet the reports from their own infantry described determined resistance from prepared positions with excellent fields of fire. The contradiction did not make sense, and in military operations, confusion creates caution. The German army commanders ordered their forces to bypass what they now believed was a hardpoint position, redirecting assault waves towards sectors they perceived as weaker. This decision had strategic consequences far beyond Jackson's small defensive sector. By creating the illusion of strength where weakness existed, Jackson's acoustic deception bought time for American reinforcements to move into the Ardennes region and begin organizing the defense that would eventually halt the entire offensive. But the immediate situation remained desperate. The 99th Infantry Division was still outnumbered and outgunned, still fighting for survival against an enemy force that could absorb losses the Americans could not match. Jackson's wooden bullets had won one engagement, but the conflict would continue for days, and his team could not maintain the deception indefinitely. On December 17th, enemy forces attempted to infiltrate American positions using smaller teams that avoided the sectors where Jackson had demonstrated his acoustic tactics. These infiltration teams achieved some initial progress, capturing several forward positions and threatening to envelope the American defensive line. Hayes called an emergency meeting of his platoon leaders, including Jackson despite the private's junior rank. Hayes said they needed something new, that the enemy was adapting to the acoustic deception, and asked if anyone had ideas. Jackson proposed something even more audacious than his initial plan. He suggested they use the wooden bullets not for deception, but for communication, creating an acoustic signaling system that could coordinate American movements without radio transmissions that might be intercepted. He had mapped the resonance patterns of different helmet types, including American helmets, and believed he could create distinct signals that would allow platoons to coordinate maneuvers silently. Lieutenant Morrison, who had become Jackson's strongest advocate, asked how this would work in practical terms. Jackson explained that by striking helmets at specific angles with controlled force, his team could create sound patterns that carried through the forest but were too brief and specific to provide targeting information to the enemy. Each pattern would correspond to a predetermined maneuver, allowing distributed units to act in concert without visual contact or radio communication. The concept built on Jackson's understanding of Morse code principles and acoustic engineering. Just as Morse code used patterns of short and long signals to convey complex information, Jackson's helmet strike system could use varying resonance patterns to communicate tactical commands. The advantage over radio communication was that the signals were extremely brief, difficult to locate precisely, and meaningless to anyone who did not know the predetermined code. The enemy might hear the sounds, but would have no framework for interpreting them as coordinated communication. Private Torres volunteered to help Jackson develop the communication code, bringing his experience as a radio operator to the challenge of creating a system that was both simple enough to execute under combat stress and complex enough to convey necessary tactical information. Together, they designed a system of 23 distinct acoustic patterns, each corresponding to a specific tactical maneuver or status report. The patterns varied in the number of strikes, the rhythm of strikes, and the specific helmet locations targeted to create different resonance qualities. The system worked better than anyone expected. Over the next 2 days, Jackson's acoustic signaling allowed the 99th Infantry Division to execute coordinated withdrawals and counterattacks that enemy forces could not anticipate or counter. American units appeared to move with uncanny coordination, despite being separated by fog and terrain, consistently avoiding enemy thrusts while concentrating forces where needed most. German commanders reported with frustration that the American defenders seemed to possess an intelligence network that could not be disrupted because it did not depend on conventional communication methods. But the true test of Jackson's innovations came on December 19th, when enemy forces launched a concentrated assault on the 99th Infantry Division's center positions with the explicit goal of breaking through to the road network beyond. The assault involved approximately 3,000 infantry soldiers, supported by armored vehicles, a force that should have overwhelmed the American defenders within hours. Hayes received orders to hold for at least 6 hours to allow reinforcements to reach the sector, knowing that conventional defense could not achieve this objective. Jackson assembled his acoustic team along with every soldier who could be spared from immediate defensive duties. He explained that they were going to create the illusion of a massive defensive position, using coordinated acoustic patterns to suggest the presence of multiple machine gun nests, mortar teams, and concentrated rifle fire. The key was synchronization. If the wooden bullets struck enemy helmets in precisely timed sequences, the resulting sounds would merge into a cacophony that suggested defensive fire much heavier than what actually existed. The plan required superhuman precision. Jackson divided his team into 7 groups, each responsible for creating specific acoustic patterns at predetermined intervals. He gave each group a section of territory to cover and explicit instructions about timing relative to the other groups. The effect he wanted to create was a rolling barrage of defensive fire that would make enemy forces believe they were advancing into a prepared position while actually encountering far less resistance than the acoustic environment suggested. Each group leader received a pocket watch, synchronized to the exact second, a crucial requirement for maintaining the timing precision that Jackson's plan demanded. The watches had been requisitioned from the battalion supply officer, who questioned why combat troops needed such precise timekeeping equipment, but ultimately provided them after Hayes personally guaranteed their return or replacement cost. As the enemy assault wave crossed into the engagement zone, Jackson signaled the first group to fire. Wooden bullets struck helmets across a 50-yard front, creating sounds that echoed through the forest like rifle fire. 3 seconds later, the second group fired at a different section of the enemy formation, then the third group, then the fourth. The cascade of acoustic impacts created the impression of coordinated fire from multiple prepared positions, exactly as Jackson had planned. But something unexpected happened that Jackson had not fully anticipated. The enemy soldiers, conditioned by days of fighting in the Ardennes fog, where sound was often the only reliable indicator of threat, began to react not just tactically, but psychologically. The distinctive ringing of bullets striking helmets from all directions created a sense of being surrounded, of advancing into a trap. Soldiers who might have pushed forward despite casualties instead went to ground, seeking cover from threats their training told them were real, even when their eyes could not confirm targets. The enemy assault wave fragmented within 12 minutes. Officers attempted to rally their troops, but the acoustic confusion was too complete. Every time a group tried to advance, Jackson's team struck helmets in patterns that suggested they were moving into concentrated fire. The psychological effect was devastating. Soldiers became convinced that any movement would draw accurate fire from hidden positions, creating paralysis across the entire assault formation. Hayes, watching this unfold from the command post, reported to battalion headquarters that the enemy assault had stalled despite achieving initial penetration of American forward positions. Battalion command asked for casualty reports and ammunition expenditure, expecting the usual grim mathematics of defensive fighting. Hayes reported fewer than 30 American casualties and less than 15% ammunition expenditure, numbers so low that battalion initially assumed the report was in error. The defense held not for 6 hours, but for 9, buying time that proved crucial to organizing the broader American response to the enemy offensive. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found the 99th Infantry Division still in position, still organized, and still capable of continuing the fight. The reinforcing units had expected to find a shattered defensive line that would require days to rebuild. Instead, They found a force that had managed to achieve what conventional military wisdom said was impossible, defeating numerically superior assault forces while conserving both personnel and material. The story of what happened in the Ardennes Forest sector, held by the 99th Infantry Division, spread through American military channels with remarkable speed. Officers who heard the initial reports dismissed them as combat exaggeration, the kind of tall tales that emerge from desperate situations. But as more witnesses corroborated the events, as enemy prisoners described the acoustic chaos they had experienced, and as physical evidence accumulated in the form of hundreds of wooden bullets scattered across the battlefield, skepticism gave way to serious analysis. A military intelligence team arrived on December 22nd to interview Jackson and his team, document their techniques, and assess whether the tactics could be replicated elsewhere. The team was led by Major Thomas Bradley, a West Point graduate with a background in physics who had been studying unconventional warfare applications. Bradley spent 3 hours interviewing Jackson, taking detailed notes about the acoustic principles involved, the specific helmet resonance patterns, and the psychological effects on enemy forces. Bradley told Jackson that what he had accomplished represented a fundamental insight into modern warfare, that the increasing mechanization and systematization of military forces created new vulnerabilities that creative thinking could exploit. He said that Jackson's techniques would be studied and potentially incorporated into training for other units, that his name would be included in after-action reports that would reach the highest levels of military command. But Bradley also cautioned that Jackson should not expect immediate recognition or reward. He explained bluntly that the military establishment was not yet ready to celebrate a black soldier's tactical innovations. That credit would likely be distributed in ways that minimized Jackson's individual contribution. Bradley said this with evident regret, acknowledging the injustice while being honest about institutional realities. Jackson accepted this information with the same calm exterior he had maintained throughout weeks of mockery. He told Bradley that recognition had never been his objective, that he had developed the acoustic tactics because they were necessary to keep his squad alive, and that knowing the techniques might save other soldiers' lives was satisfaction enough. But privately, in letters home that would be preserved by his family, Jackson expressed frustration at being simultaneously valuable and invisible, his contributions celebrated in private briefings but unlikely to appear in official histories. The immediate effect of Jackson's innovations was visible in the changed attitudes of his own unit. Corporal O'Brien, who had mocked Jackson mercilessly about the wooden bullets, approached him on December 23rd with evident discomfort. O'Brien said quietly that he had been wrong about Jackson, that he had let prejudice and ignorance cloud his judgment, and that he wanted to apologize. Jackson accepted the apology with a simple handshake, choosing not to dwell on the weeks of insults he had endured. More significantly, Lieutenant Hayes formally requested that Jackson be promoted to sergeant and given responsibility for training other soldiers in acoustic tactics. Hayes wrote in his recommendation that Jackson had demonstrated exceptional initiative, technical expertise, and leadership under combat conditions, that his innovations had directly contributed to the defense of critical positions, and that his abilities were being wasted in his current role. The recommendation went through channels slowly, encountering resistance from officers who questioned whether a black soldier should be elevated to positions of greater authority. The broader Battle of the Ardennes continued for weeks after Jackson's acoustic defense, involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers and resulting in enormous casualties on both sides. The enemy offensive ultimately failed to achieve its strategic objectives, stopped by American resistance that proved far more resilient than German planners had anticipated. Multiple factors contributed to this outcome, including supply shortages, weather conditions, and the arrival of Allied reinforcements. But in the specific sector held by the 99th Infantry Division, the defense succeeded in large part because one engineer with wooden bullets had recognized a vulnerability that traditional military thinking had missed. After-action analysis conducted in January 1945 revealed that enemy forces had redirected approximately 2 divisions away from the 99th Infantry Division's sector, believing it to be more heavily defended than intelligence suggested. This redeployment created gaps in the enemy assault plan that American forces exploited, contributing to the eventual failure of the offensive. The analysis credited tactical deception for creating these favorable conditions, but did not mention Jackson by name, attributing the success to unnamed personnel at the unit level. Jackson continued to serve with the 99th Infantry Division through the end of the conflict in Europe, participating in the advance into Germany and the eventual occupation. He was promoted to sergeant in March 1945, 4 months after Hayes had submitted the recommendation. The delay was never explained officially, though soldiers who knew the circumstances understood exactly what it meant. Jackson trained dozens of soldiers in acoustic tactics during the final months of combat operations, though the techniques proved less effective as fighting moved out of densely forested terrain into urban environments where acoustic patterns behaved differently. The training Jackson provided to other soldiers represented one of the most significant but least documented aspects of his contribution to the war effort. He developed a systematic curriculum for teaching acoustic warfare principles, starting with basic sound physics and progressing through tactical applications. His students learned to identify different helmet types by their resonance characteristics, to calculate optimal striking angles for maximum acoustic effect, and to coordinate timing for creating complex sound patterns. Several of these trained soldiers went on to apply acoustic deception techniques in other theaters, though the specific connection to Jackson's original innovations was rarely acknowledged in official records. When the war ended, Jackson returned to Philadelphia and resumed his engineering studies, earning a master's degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Pennsylvania. He worked for 37 years as an acoustic engineer, contributing to developments in sonar technology, architectural acoustics, and noise reduction systems. His colleagues in civilian life knew he had served in the military, but were unaware of the innovations he had developed under combat conditions. Jackson rarely discussed his wartime experiences, preferring to focus on present work rather than past accomplishments. The wooden bullets that Jackson had crafted with such care were mostly lost or discarded after the battle. A few were collected by soldiers as souvenirs, curiosities from a strange episode in an incomprehensible war. One was preserved by Sergeant Morrison, who kept it in his desk drawer for the rest of his life, as a reminder that solutions to impossible problems sometimes come from unexpected sources if you are willing to listen. The story of Jackson's acoustic tactics occasionally surfaced in military history discussions, usually framed as an interesting tactical innovation without specific attribution. A few historians who investigated the Battle of the Ardennes encountered references to unusual defensive techniques employed by the 99th Infantry Division, but could not find detailed documentation because much of the relevant material remained classified or had been lost in post-war record consolidation. The official histories mentioned tactical deception and creative use of limited resources, but did not explain the specific mechanisms involved. Lieutenant Hayes, who became a successful businessman after the war, maintained correspondence with Jackson for nearly 40 years. In letters preserved by both families, Hayes repeatedly expressed gratitude for Jackson's innovations and frustration at the military's failure to properly recognize his contributions. Hayes wrote in 1978 that Jackson's tactical genius had saved his life and the lives of countless soldiers, that the lack of official recognition was a failure of justice, and that he hoped future generations would understand what Jackson had accomplished. The deeper significance of Jackson's story lies not just in the tactical innovations he developed, but in what those innovations revealed about modern warfare and institutional prejudice. Jackson succeeded because he approached military problems as an engineer rather than a traditional soldier, recognizing that the increasing systematization of warfare created vulnerabilities that could be exploited through understanding of physics, psychology, and human behavior. His wooden bullets worked not because they were weapons in the conventional sense, but because they turned the enemy's own training and tactical discipline into sources of confusion and paralysis. Yet this success emerged from conditions created by prejudice. Jackson developed his acoustic tactics partly because he was excluded from traditional command structures that might have channeled his abilities into conventional applications. His outsider status gave him perspective that insiders lacked, allowing him to see possibilities that military doctrine did not accommodate. The same prejudice that made him the target of mockery also freed him to think unconventionally, creating innovations that challenged fundamental assumptions about how warfare should be conducted. The men who initially laughed at Jackson's wooden bullets were responding to their own limited understanding of what constituted effective military action. Their mockery reflected deep cultural assumptions about masculinity, combat, and racial capability that made it difficult to recognize genius when it appeared in unexpected forms. The transformation of that mockery into respect happened not through persuasion or argument, but through demonstrated results that could not be denied. Jackson's vindication came through performance, through the undeniable evidence that his supposedly ridiculous ideas achieved what conventional wisdom said was impossible. The 28 enemy soldiers who went down without a sound during Jackson's acoustic defense did not fall to lethal force, but to their own trained responses, to the conditioning that made them react to specific stimuli in predictable ways. They were defeated not by superior firepower, but by superior understanding of how humans process information under tension, how sound propagates through cold air and fog, and how tactical discipline can become a liability when exploited by someone who understands its mechanisms. The engagement Jackson won was fought with physics and psychology rather than explosives and steel, demonstrating that warfare is ultimately about making opponents act against their own interests rather than simply destroying their capacity to fight. In the decades after the war, as military organizations invested heavily in electronic warfare, psychological operations, and information dominance, Jackson's acoustic tactics appeared increasingly prescient. The principles he applied, exploiting enemy communication systems, creating sensory confusion, turning training into vulnerability, became central to modern military doctrine. Yet the connection between these sophisticated contemporary approaches and the wooden bullets fired by a black engineer in the Ardennes forest remained largely unrecognized except by specialists who studied the evolution of tactical deception. Jackson passed away in 1993 at the age of 72, having lived a successful civilian life largely disconnected from his wartime innovations. His obituary in the Philadelphia newspaper mentioned his military service briefly, noting that he had been a combat engineer in Europe, but providing no details about his specific contributions. The wooden bullets that had saved hundreds of lives and altered the course of an engagement went unmentioned. Their story known only to a dwindling number of veterans who had witnessed what happened, but struggled to explain it to people who had not been there. The legacy of Jackson's innovations persists in unexpected ways. Military training programs now include extensive instruction in acoustic deception and the exploitation of sensory confusion, though the instructors teaching these techniques rarely know their origins. The understanding that enemy training creates vulnerabilities as well as capabilities has become fundamental to modern military planning, informing everything from electronic warfare to psychological operations. The insight that small, precisely applied interventions can achieve disproportionate effects through exploitation of system-level vulnerabilities has shaped decades of tactical development. But perhaps the most important legacy is the reminder that genius and innovation can emerge from anyone, regardless of their position in institutional hierarchies or their demographic characteristics. Jackson's story demonstrates that excluding people from full participation in institutions does not just harm those individuals, but deprives the institutions of potentially valuable contributions. The military that mocked Jackson's wooden bullets and delayed his promotion was the same military that benefited from his innovations, creating a profound contradiction that speaks to the complex relationship between prejudice and organizational effectiveness. The soldiers of the 99th Infantry Division who witnessed Jackson's acoustic defense carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives, though many struggled to convey the experience to others. How do you explain that you survived an engagement because someone figured out how to turn wooden bullets into psychological tools? How do you make people understand that the most effective defense sometimes involves no traditional defensive fire at all? The stories they told at veteran gatherings had an almost mythical quality, tales of impossible events that seemed too strange to be true, yet were documented in official records for those willing to search. The German soldiers who experienced the acoustic confusion from the other side had their own stories, though these were colored by the difficulty of explaining how they had been stopped by something they could not fully understand. In post-war interviews, some described the engagement as encountering an American defensive position that seemed to be everywhere at once, firing from all directions simultaneously in ways that did not match their intelligence about enemy force dispositions. They talked about the distinctive sound of projectiles striking helmets, about the confusion of receiving contradictory signals, about the overwhelming sense that they were advancing into a trap. The truth, that they had been defeated largely by wooden projectiles fired by a small team of soldiers who understood acoustic physics, emerged slowly through intelligence analysis and post-war research. German military analysts studied the Battle of the Ardennes extensively, trying to understand how their carefully planned offensive had failed. The role of acoustic deception appeared in some classified analyses, but did not make it into mainstream historical accounts, partly because the phenomenon was difficult to explain, and partly because acknowledging such an unconventional defeat seemed to diminish the narrative of having been stopped by conventional military superiority. The intersection of race, innovation, and institutional recognition that Jackson's story represents has profound implications that extend far beyond military history. His experience illustrates how prejudice creates blind spots that prevent organizations from recognizing and utilizing available talent, how institutional resistance to unconventional thinking can persist even when that thinking demonstrably works, and how individual genius can overcome systemic barriers through sheer force of competence and results. Jackson did not wait for permission to innovate. He identified a problem, developed a solution, and implemented it despite skepticism and mockery. The wooden bullets themselves, those carefully crafted projectiles that seemed so laughable to Jackson's squadmates, embody a deeper truth about innovation. They worked not because they were intrinsically powerful, but because they exploited a specific vulnerability in a specific context. Their effectiveness depended on understanding enemy tactics, acoustic physics, human psychology, and the particular environmental conditions of the Ardennes forest in winter. They were a solution precisely tailored to a unique problem, demonstrating that effective innovation often involves deep contextual understanding rather than general-purpose brilliance. The transformation in how Jackson was perceived by his unit, from ridiculed outsider to respected innovator, happened remarkably quickly once his tactics proved effective. This rapid shift suggests that prejudice, while deeply rooted, can be overcome by undeniable results, though it also raises questions about why competence demonstrations should be necessary in the first place. Jackson had to prove himself in ways that his white peers did not, had to achieve extraordinary results to receive recognition that others might have gained through ordinary performance. The injustice of this standard does not diminish his achievement, but rather highlights the additional obstacles he overcame. The military intelligence team that studied Jackson's techniques represented an interesting institutional response, recognition of value combined with prediction of limited official acknowledgement. Major Bradley's candid assessment that Jackson would not receive appropriate credit was both honest and revealing, an acknowledgement that the military understood the worth of Jackson's contributions but lacked the institutional will to properly honor them. This gap between private recognition and public acknowledgement characterized much of the black experience in the American military during this era, creating a shadow history of contributions that were valued but not celebrated. The soldiers who learned acoustic tactics from Jackson during the final months of the war carried those skills into post-war life, though few found civilian applications for the specific techniques. But the broader lesson, that creative problem-solving and unconventional thinking could overcome apparently insurmountable obstacles, influenced how they approached challenges in their civilian careers. Several became successful engineers, teachers, and business owners, attributing their willingness to think differently to what they had learned from Jackson under combat conditions. The Ardennes forest where these events unfolded has long since recovered from the devastation of winter 1944 and 45. The foxholes and defensive positions have eroded, the trees have regrown, and the landscape shows little evidence of the desperate fighting that occurred there. But the ground still holds artifacts from the engagement, expended cartridges, fragments of equipment, and occasionally wooden projectiles that puzzled foresters and hikers who discovered them without understanding their significance. These wooden bullets, weathered and degraded, are physical remnants of innovation born from necessity, testament to the ingenuity that emerges when survival depends on thinking differently. The families of soldiers who served with Jackson preserved his story through private memories and correspondence, creating an informal archive that captured details official histories missed. These family records document not just what Jackson did, but how he did it, the quiet determination he displayed, the careful planning that preceded his tactical innovations, and the grace with which he handled both mockery and vindication. They preserve a human dimension that military records necessarily omit, showing Jackson as a complete person rather than merely a tactical innovator. The question of what might have happened if Jackson's innovations had received broader implementation during the war remains a matter of historical speculation. Could acoustic tactics have been effectively applied in other combat environments? Would different terrain or weather conditions have limited their effectiveness? The evidence suggests that Jackson's techniques were highly context-dependent, most effective in the specific conditions of the Ardennes forest, where fog and acoustic properties created ideal circumstances. But the underlying principles, exploiting enemy training, creating sensory confusion, using physics to multiply combat effectiveness, had broader applicability that was never fully explored during the conflict. The recognition Jackson did receive came primarily from fellow soldiers who witnessed his innovations firsthand and understood their significance. This peer recognition, while personally meaningful, did not translate into the official honors and historical acknowledgement his contributions deserved. He was never awarded the medals that typically accompany tactical innovations of such impact, never invited to speak at military academies about his techniques, never consulted by military planners developing post-war doctrine. His expertise was utilized during the conflict, but largely forgotten afterward, a pattern that characterized the military's relationship with many black soldiers who served with distinction. The story of Jackson's wooden bullets challenges comfortable narratives about how innovation happens and who gets credit for transformative ideas. It demonstrates that breakthrough thinking often comes from margins rather than centers, from people who have been excluded from conventional pathways and therefore approach problems from different angles. It shows that institutional hierarchies can be barriers to recognizing valuable contributions, particularly when those contributions come from individuals whose demographic characteristics do not match institutional expectations about who possesses expertise. The 28 soldiers who went down during Jackson's acoustic defense became an unwitting symbol of how warfare was changing, how industrial-age conflicts created new vulnerabilities alongside new capabilities. Their trained responses, which should have made them more effective soldiers, became liabilities when confronted with someone who understood the mechanisms of that training. They represented the paradox of modern military forces. The systematization that creates operational effectiveness also creates predictability that clever opponents can exploit. Jackson's genius lay in recognizing this paradox and developing techniques that turned enemy strengths into weaknesses. The laughter that greeted Jackson's wooden bullets represented more than simple mockery of an apparently foolish idea. It reflected deep assumptions about what constituted legitimate military action, about who possessed the authority to innovate, and about the relationship between technology and combat effectiveness. The soldiers who laughed were responding to violations of their mental models about how warfare worked, unable to imagine that wooden projectiles could accomplish anything of military value. Their inability to see beyond conventional categories prevented them from recognizing innovation when it appeared in unexpected forms. The silence that followed, the absence of sound when enemy soldiers dropped in response to acoustic confusion rather than lethal force, represented a different kind of warfare, one based on information and psychology rather than physical destruction. This silence was more effective than the noise of conventional combat, achieving tactical objectives while conserving resources and minimizing harm on both sides. It demonstrated that the most sophisticated forms of warfare involve making enemies defeat themselves rather than destroying them through superior force. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.